Shalom, and welcome back again to Window on Mount Zion, Chapter 7 and Part 4, which concludes the chapter. And we are now at the conclusion also of the Six-Day War, but it's still continuing, although Jerusalem had been secured. And this is Thursday, June the 8th, 1967. The sun was beginning to give light to another day. I looked out of my window and saw the soldiers, exhausted, asleep on the ground. It was a strange sight in the Pope's parking lot and Garden Square to see them covered with soldiers sleeping. And gradually they stirred to life, and the cooks outside our front gate began to prepare their breakfast. Then the day started for us in the house. They wanted only two things, the telephone and water. Because of damage to the water pipes on Mount Zion, they were without water, and we refilled their water bottles until our own supplies ran out. But what they wanted most of all was to be allowed to use the telephone. Through most of the day, they waited in an endless queue, in a line that stretched far. It seemed to use, for some had been unable to contact their families for a fortnight. The conversations made dents in one's soul. A young man spoke to his wife. She had heard that he had been killed and was in the midst of the 7 days of mourning for her dead. He could not make her understand that he was still alive. Again and again he said, "It is Joseph speaking, Yosef, your husband. I am alive, I am alive. Don't you understand? I am alive and speaking to you from Mount Zion. Soon I'll be back home." Then he spoke to his little children, and his face was set to hide his emotion. An older man spoke to his father. "Abba, Abba, Father, I've seen our old home in the old city where they dragged you out and took you prisoner 20 years ago. We will go back to our old home, Abba. I will take you there." Tears trickled down his face. He pulled a key from his pocket and said to me, "This is the key of our old home. I've kept it for 20 years. My mother gave it to me when she and other women with young children were allowed to go into the New Jerusalem before they burned the houses and synagogues in the Jewish quarter of the old city. I always believed I would find the house one day and took the key with me into battle. Our house escaped the flames and the key still fits." Another young blue-eyed soldier, not more than 19, spoke to his anxious mother, who had not heard from him for 2 weeks. Fathers came, talking to their children, husbands to their wives, sons to their parents. It was hard to get them away from the telephone. These men had come through great dangers. Some told of comrades killed or wounded at their side. It was a long emotional day. So much joy, so much tragedy, and such a consciousness of having experienced a miracle. Even those who had no religious beliefs at all had to acknowledge that something had happened which was beyond their powers alone. They had all fought valiantly and were prepared to sacrifice their lives, but they knew that this was not all that had given them the victory. Everyone seemed to be saying with the commander of Mount Zion, it was as though someone else was commanding. In fact, one religious soldier said, "I hope that our people will not forget that God has given us this victory." His words reminded me of the time of the siege of Jerusalem in 1948, when I had been in Jerusalem at the age of 19. Then, too, a wave of religious fervor swept through the people. "Yes," I answered, "we hope that this experience will strengthen the faith of our people and bring a deeper realization of the fact that when Israel fights her battles, there are also the armies of God fighting with her." "That was always true," replied the soldier. just as he fights for us now. And as Psalm 121 tells us, behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. Friday, June the 9th. In the first pale light of dawn, I looked out of my window and saw intense action among the soldiers, some coming, some going. Then I learned that Egypt had accepted the United Nations ceasefire, and the war in the south in the Sinai was over. A new sound drew me to my window. A large bulldozer was noisily climbing the hill. I watched it turn clumsily to face the corrugated iron fence which marked the border, which had marred the beauty of the landscape and was a constant reminder of the divided Jerusalem. How intensely I'd always wished it could be removed. The bulldozer was in position, its motor full on. I watched, excited and almost breathless. With a roar and a rattle, I saw it break through the fence, wrenching it apart and crushing it under its wheels. Then, with an added roar of power, it approached the stone building of the Jordanian military post behind the fence near our house. Nothing could stop its advance. As it passed, broken walls and mounds of scattered stones and debris were all that was left. But the great majestic trees which had shielded it from view also lay prostrate in the dust. The border had disappeared and a new road was being made. After a little more than an hour of continuous work with the bulldozer, a small part of the way was cleared, and I saw a car coming through from the old city. It was hard to grasp the significance of this. Free passage from the old city to the new, a safe and free road from Mount Zion to the wall, all barriers down, and it was only 5 days since the war started. In this picture, you can see it's not the road she's talking about actually leading into the old city from Mount Zion, but it is another road coming from the other direction, heading towards the Montefiore windmill, which you can see in the center, at the top of the road, and the new neighborhood there, and which looks straight across to Mount Zion. But there you can see the Dormition Abbey, which did suffer damage. There's the tower, and then next to it on the left you can see the church itself, and that dome had been damaged. But that is a view towards Mount Zion. There were occasional shots from snipers in the vicinity and the sound of mines exploding. Some, anxious to find a way into the old city, had walked in forbidden areas, and many were injured by miners, by the mines, or by snipers. It was still dangerous to move freely. Our telephone was ringing continuously, friends inquiring how we were. Some walked up the steps to see for themselves that everything was all right, for it was not yet permitted to use the road. So many good friends. Our greatest problem was water. The supply was very low, and we only had a trickle of water in the garden for use in the house. The poor garden was very parched, but was doing its best to survive. The soldiers still came to the telephone, but most of them were now leaving Mount Zion and were being posted elsewhere. Meanwhile, we were still trying to clean up the house. At midday, we were allowed to use the car to go into town. I'd expected to see much damage in the city as a result of those 2 days of heavy shelling, but I found no more than an occasional wall with some stones knocked out and a few broken windows. Even in the center of the city, everything seemed to be going on normally. I had heard that the Knesset Museum and University had been hit, but was told that very little damage had been done. It was all part of the miracle. Shops were open and business was as usual, and only 5 days after the war had begun. We did some shopping collected letters and cables from anxious relatives and friends, then returned home to prepare for the Sabbath. By the evening of Saturday or Shabbat, June the 10th, when the Syrians agreed to cease fire, the 6-day war was over. So join us for part 1 of chapter 8. Well, actually, chapter 8, the week after the war. And that will be the final chapter of Window on Mount Zion next time. Until then, Shalom.